Coming into this season, Red Bull looked outside of their driver academy for the first time since 2008, as they recruited Sergio Pérez in a move which was deemed essential given both Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon failed to live up to the expectations of that second Red Bull seat. So which of them stacks up as the best option? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Now, before I get too far into this video, I want to offer a few caveats. The first of these is that obviously Pierre Gasly only had half a season in the Red Bull seat, not a full year or even the year and a half that Perez and Albon received respectively. It should also be said that of course these drivers all raced in different cars, apart from the 2019 Challenger which both Albon and Gasly raced. So any statistics used need to be taken with a pinch of salt, as of course one of these drivers has had a championship winning car. Performance compared to Verstappen. The first point of comparison to make is looking at how these drivers fared when compared to Max Verstappen. In his 12-race stint at Red Bull, Pierre Gasly scored 63 points, compared to Verstappen's 181. Alongside this, Verstappen had scored 5 podiums, which included 2 race wins to Gasly's best finishing position of 4th at the British Grand Prix. So Gasly scored just 34.8% of Verstappen's points, a shockingly low proportion. To compare this with Alex Albon in 2019, Albon scored 76 points to Verstappen's 97 in the 9 remaining races of the season. This is 78.4% of Verstappen's point score, so far higher than the proportion achieved by Pierre Gasly. It's worth noting that Albon's highest finishing position was also 4th, so matching Gasly in this department, but evidently the consistent top 6 finishes were what made Albon stand out by comparison. There are of course some nuances in this comparison in the 2019 season, with retirements and race incidents obviously playing a factor in the points proportions. For example, Verstappen had 2 retirements in the second half of the year compared to none when he was competing against Gasly. Meanwhile, Albon didn't retire but did get a spun out in Brazil, which left him out of the point scoring contention when he was on track for a podium finish. But regardless, 78.4% of Verstappen's points compared to 34.8% for Gasly is not even close. For Albon's first full season in 2020, he scored 105 points to Verstappen's 214. This represents just 49% of the Dutch driver's total, and significantly less than the 78.4% he achieved in the second half of 2019. In 2020, Verstappen was slightly closer to the Mercedes drivers than in 2019, so you could argue that the 2020 Red Bull car was slightly better. To look at this more carefully, you can assess the drivers' average finishing positions when compared with each other. In 2019, Albon's Red Bull average finishing position was 6.22, or 5.25 if you remove the Brazil result. Verstappen's average finishing position in the same time frame was 3.86. Into 2020, Albon's average finishing position was 7.75 compared to Verstappen's 2.42, so it does seem like while Verstappen took a step forward, Albon went backwards. In 2021, Sergio Pérez has achieved 190 points to Verstappen's 395.5. That represents 48% of the champion's points scored, so that's actually 1 percentage point lower than Albon achieved through 2020. There are a number of considerations to explain this, the first of which being the fact that as you finish higher in the races, the number of points scored is greater, and therefore naturally the gaps will be greater also. The proportion of points from 3rd to 1st, for example, is 60%, whereas the proportion of points from 3rd to 5th is 66%. So as Verstappen was the lead driver in 2021, the proportion of points scored by Sergio Pérez was likely to be lower, hence the use of this statistic is somewhat flawed. What's perhaps a better metric is the fact that Sergio Pérez's average finishing position was 6.6 to Verstappen's 1.84 in 2021. So Pérez, in terms of finishing position at least, was a step forward on Alex Albon, but it is much closer between Albon and Pérez when it comes down to these numbers. In terms of the best teammate from a statistical perspective when compared to Verstappen, it is probably Albon in the second half of 2019, followed by Sergio Pérez over the full 2021 season. But as I've said on a number of occasions, just looking at the points or finishing positions doesn't really tell us the full story. But before we take a look at the rest of the story comparing these Red Bull drivers, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has liked, subscribed, or even watched these videos over the last few weeks. The support has just been incredible. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to be the first to see any new videos in advance of the 2022 season. Thanks. Driver experience. Historically, one of the main principles of the Red Bull Driver Academy has been to promote from within. They have always backed their own drivers and given them ample opportunity. Daniel Ricciardo leaving the team in a shock move to Renault caught the Red Bull team off guard. As a result, they didn't have a driver that was prepared in the Toro Rosso car that could step up into the team. At the time of his promotion, Gasly had been in the Toro Rosso car for just over a year. Only 2 Red Bull drivers had been successful given such a short stint in the Toro Rosso car, and those 2 were Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen. So Gasly would have a tough challenge to compete with those 2 world champions and be able to prove himself in the Red Bull so quickly. There was also a lack of confidence regarding Gasly. At the time he was promoted into the Red Bull, he had achieved just 5-point scoring finishes in his F1 career, so he was undoubtedly at risk. After dropping Gasly, Red Bull promoted an even less experienced driver. Alex Albon had just 12 races under his belt in Formula 1, and, like Gasly, he achieved just 5-point scoring finishes. So Albon is the least experienced driver to ever compete in a Red Bull, and interestingly, he performed incredibly well in that first half of the season in the car, with all of his finishes bar that one in Brazil being a top 6. But fundamentally, the core skills that drivers develop through testing or racing experience includes aspects like how to advise the team on car development, or how to consider a new car setup direction. Now, I'm not saying Albon was particularly bad at this, I couldn't comment on that, but fundamentally he will have had less experience in advising on those changes. So this is where, from a driver experience perspective, Sergio Pérez was the new direction for the Red Bull team. 2021 was Perez's 11th Formula 1 season, and Red Bull is the 4th team that he's raced for. He's also been involved in a number of challenging cars, thinking back to the 2019 Racing Point, or the 2015 Force India, which they swapped out for a B-Spec halfway through the season. So Perez's F1 experience has been unrivaled when it comes to these 3 options for the Red Bull seat. Not to mention the fact that Perez has had 10 podium finishes to his name before the start of the year, and of course, that race win at the Sakir Grand Prix in 2020. So when you look at driver experience, there's no doubt that both Gasly and Albon were well and truly thrown in at the deep end when it comes to their Red Bull seats. There have been drivers that have been ready for a front-running car from the off in their careers, but it's still a tall order for any F1 driver. Fundamentally, for most teams, if they had the choice between an experienced driver like Perez or an inexperienced driver like Gasly or Albon with lots of potential, they'd take the experienced driver any day, particularly in this era of Formula 1 where testing is limited. There is a question over whether Red Bull have solved this problem. In the currently unlikely event that Perez or Verstappen were to leave Red Bull at the end of the 2022 season, would the team be ready with a replacement? Both Albon and Gasly will be on the grid next year and could step back into the team, but would they be lacking a driver that could lead the team to a championship as Verstappen has in 2021? The eye test. The final point of comparison for me between Perez, Gasly and Albon needs to be the eye test. This is me doing away with the statistics and data and just looking at how they've done and how they've performed in the Red Bull. The first point in this section, I believe, is related to driver experience. Both Albon and Gasly rarely looked confident when racing in that Red Bull seat. Naturally, given the ruthless nature of the driver academy with the attitude being to perform or you're out, these drivers were put in a similar position while also being on a global stage with the whole world asking the question of whether they would be retained for the next season or not. There is no better example of this than Pierre Gasly. Gasly was inexperienced, as I've already covered, but once the pressure was on in the Red Bull, it seemed like he was a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. Few drivers had failed to achieve results in the Red Bull before. The only driver to be dropped by the team before Gasly was Daniel Ricciardo, and the fact that the team had Verstappen waiting in the wings to replace the Russian driver was certainly a factor in that decision. For Gasly, he was under so much media pressure, and that definitely influenced the decision of the Red Bull team to drop him back down to Toro Rosso. It was an incredibly challenging environment for him to be in, and he even said that a number of people within the team began to doubt him at the winter testing in 2019. For me, that will have certainly contributed to his subsequent demotion. But on the other hand, when looking at the results, Gasly was never anywhere near to Verstappen. He was a way off in qualifying and then struggled to make progress. Red Bull are a team that should come into the winter testing period with a desire to win the championship. They should be up at the top in every season. So even though it was clear that they wouldn't be close to winning the title in 2019, they were keen to ensure that they had the right driver in the car for 2020 to ensure that they could compete for the title if they had the right car for it. Interestingly, when Albon was at his best in the second half of the 2019 season, he was a rookie, a driver who was told he had nothing to lose given he didn't really have a reputation in the sport. This seemed to put him in a place where he was able to drive with confidence, but once the pressure was on more in 2020, Albon never looked to be as confident when driving that Red Bull car. The pressure was on for him as it was for Gasly in 2019, and the momentum seemed to drop off for the Thai driver. Albon went from being in the mix in the top 6 as he needed to be in 2019 to then being in the midfield pack for 2020 despite the Red Bull car being significantly better than the Ferrari. There were moments that could have been completely different for Albon. He was on for a potential race win at the first round in Austria. Had that happened and he wasn't spun out by Hamilton, it could have put him in a stronger place and potentially on course to continue the strong showings he put in during the 2019 season. But again, as with Gasly, when you consider Albon's performances, there was a doubt over whether he could support the team and Verstappen in the event that they had a championship-winning car. And this is where Sergio Pérez, for me, is the best option Red Bull could have taken. The Mexican driver did get off to a relatively slow start, but there were always signs of potential. That race in France where he was in the mix and able to compete with the Mercedes car is a perfect example of this. And while it did feel that it was taking a long time for the driver to get up to speed, I believe this was exacerbated by the fact that he was up against a Verstappen raising his game to fight for the title. Going into the second half of the year, Perez started to find his form and be there more often than not when competing at the front. His performances in Turkey, the USA and in Mexico were excellent, and that defensive drive in Abu Dhabi was crucial to the title-winning race for Max Verstappen. Perez said throughout the 2021 season that he was learning from Verstappen's data and the differences in their driving style, and it seems like on the face of it, Perez was more adaptable than these other two drivers. There is, of course, that final point here, which is the fact that Perez did indeed support in the title fight. Sure, Red Bull failed to win the Constructors' Championship, but by the actions of the teams, it was only the driver's title that they particularly cared about anyway. So Perez has done the job that he was employed to do, and that's exactly why he was the right driver for the second Red Bull seat. What this means for the future is particularly interesting. Perez is 31 years old, so he will soon be past his peak. He's certainly the right driver to see Red Bull through these new regulations, but I would question whether he's still the right driver for the foreseeable future. Gasly and Albon are both in Formula 1 still and could well be called back to the Red Bull team at some point soon. But would that be too much of a risk for the Austrian team? I guess time will tell on that one. Let me know what you think of this comparison. Who would you put in that seat? Let me know in the comments, and thanks very much for watching.